Thank you very much. This is actually year 18. So Chris took a chance on a 25-year-old back in 2007, and I'll always be very grateful for this platform, this opportunity. These guys do it right. Please support them. My credit card's on file at Perform Better because we buy so much of their goodies, and Aaron's always super quick to respond to us and amazing customer service. So obviously you guys will experience that this weekend, but can't thank them enough for this platform. Also, just a little bit of housekeeping. As we get going here today, I am hardwired to do 60-minute presentations. So we're a few minutes behind, so it actually works well. But most importantly, it's good that you got Gray in this room before me for two reasons. One, he introduced some concepts that I'm going to build on, and also I'm going to reiterate, so I think they're important. But two, I tend to talk a lot faster than Gray, so it's giving you a little time for your coffee to kick in. Hopefully you can keep up. But with that in mind, please raise your hand, slow me down. In one of my first presentations all the way back in like 2010, one of the attendees described me as a chipmunk with ADD on amphetamines. So when I get going a little bit quickly, it helps to hear from you guys if I need to kind of slow things down. So please don't be shy. I encourage interruptions, and obviously catch me in the Q&A room afterwards. I'm thrilled to answer any questions you have. So today we're going to talk about how we batch strategies for efficient evaluating and programming. This is born out of, honestly, need. Okay, so we opened our first facility, Cressey Sports Performance in Massachusetts, back in 2007. Started out training just about everybody in this baseball niche, kind of found us. And over the course of time, our brand grew, our national reputation grew. We opened a second location down in Florida in 2014, and then in 2019, went to our showcase location, which is kind of its own little spring training complex. And this is actually an old drone footage. There's now another 12,000 square foot building. We're actually connecting and enclosing these two spaces here. So when all is said and done, this will be 31,000 square feet of training spaces on top of outdoor turf, field, lots of moving parts all taking place. And just to make life more interesting, I took a second full-time job working for the New York Yankees at the end of 2019. So my role is Director of Player Health and Performance. In that role, I oversee strength and conditioning, nutrition, and aspects of massage therapy in our organization. So really what you have is you have a staff in Massachusetts of strength and conditioning coaches, skill development, hitting and pitching coaches. We have physical therapists on staff. We have massage therapists, obviously administrative staff. We have the exact same thing, about 3 times as big in Florida. And then in my Yankees role, we have 4 strength and conditioning coaches in the Dominican Republic at our academy. We have a nutritionist there. We have 4 dietitians in the US. We have strength and conditioning coaches at every affiliate. 2 strength and conditioning coaches in the big, because we have minor league coordinator, rehab strength coordinator. So we have a lot of people that I kind of have to work with on a daily basis in more of a leadership role. But what I also thought a lot about, kind of as I pulled this presentation together, is I always emphasize to our staff, to our athletes, that we're not just a training facility, we're a teaching facility as well. It's very important to us not just to deliver a training effect to our athletes, but to make them understand the why behind what we're doing with them, how they're unique, what's special about them. But just as importantly, we need to educate our staff, our interns on how to get the best results possible. So we have interns that are working in all aspects of professional sports. One of them worked for the Dodgers and beat me in the World Series last year. So things do come full circle in that regard. So I really have emphasized a lot more of my teaching role over the last 5 to 7 years as I've taken on more responsibilities. It obviously requires hiring good people that you can really invest in. But I think just as importantly, you have to set aside the time to teach them the things that you think are really important to accurately represent your approach, your model. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. I've been very interested in this concept of education and scale over the past 5 years. So that said, this is our original facility. It's an old, I think this is actually a digital camera photo before iPhones existed back in 2007. If you get close, you might need a tetanus shot because there was that much rust in the space. Those windows needed to be scraped. This is before we put up walls or anything like that. This is where we started in July of 2007. And I don't remember saying it, but my business partner, Pete Dupuis, who also speaks on the Perform Better tour, he said, one day you said our business model should never dictate our training model. And apparently I said it actually on the ride to Rhode Island when we did a shopping spree at PB headquarters to basically outfit all of our stuff. But it was something that was very compelling for him. My mindset had always been, if baseball is going to be our niche, if we're going to do really, really well in this world, we need to bring in equipment, that related to, hey, you're going to do shoulder and elbow rehabs. You better have some safety squat bars, right? You better have sleds because they're not always going to be able to grip stuff. So we built out a facility, I think, on the the equipment side of things that really accommodated this, but never did I appreciate where the industry would go after that date. And what really happened is strength and conditioning, much like unfortunately youth sports, got much, much more specialized. If you walk into a facility on a daily basis, you're going to see 85% baseball players. And we deal with PGA golfers and pro tennis players and NFL guys and weekend warriors and folks from all different walks of life. But baseball is kind of where we make our money. And what's interesting about that is we did 59 evaluations on college baseball players last week alone at our Florida facility as they came back. I'm knee deep in amateur draft preparations for Yankee stuff going into July. I look at every pro free agent prospect that we review. So I'm basically probably have the largest sample size of evaluation, data collection, medical histories of really anyone in the baseball industry. And I'm fortunate to have drawn a really large sample size. So it allows you to kind of see what's important, see what isn't, draw some conclusions. I've never been disappointed but from collecting data. Even if you don't use it, you have it. You never know if 5 years down the road, you look back on it and you say, hey, that was actually really good that we collected it. And the number one thing that I walk away from all of that sample size with is this mindset of staying away from average. Okay, and I've used this slide actually like probably 3 of my last 4 or 5 Perform Better talks because I believe in it so much. Outstanding book, great audio book you guys can listen to on the way home. Todd Rose is a Harvard PhD. Basically, that you want to avoid basing interventions average. The real difficulty is not finding new ways to distinguish talent. It's getting rid of the one-dimensional blinders that prevented us from seeing it all along. We live in a world that demands we will be the same as everyone else, only better, and reduces the American dream to a narrow yearning to be relatively better than the people around us rather than the best versions of ourselves. We get into a lot of trouble when we take a huge data set and we try to conform everybody to the middle. When I look at guys for the amateur draft right now, I'm looking to embrace weird wherever I possibly can. Big leaguers come in all shapes and sizes. They do unique things. So I always try to figure out how is this athlete making their freak flag fly? What's different about them that works? And you'd be amazed at how many absolute weirdos are in the big leagues from the movement competency stuff. Guys who have these like freaky wrists that do strange things, unyielding hypermobility. They do something really, really well, right? And what's fascinating is you can actually find this in the data. This is a study I talk about a lot. Mike Reinold's a good friend. At the time, he was a physical therapist and had ATC for the Boston Red Sox back in 2008. They pulled this study, and there was really a study looking at how pitchers respond to throwing, right? Go out and throw 90 pitches, and then we're going to measure your range of motion right after, and then we're going to measure it again 24 hours after, right? So look at ER, IR. ER plus IR is total motion. So before they threw, they were at 190 degrees. Afterwards, they were 11 degrees lower, right? And then if you came back, they recouped about 3 degrees. But for all intents and purposes, it tells us in general, if we look at the whole baseball population, guys are going to lose about 8 degrees at the 24-hour mark, right? Lots of eccentric stress. You throw a baseball, your arm wants to pop out of the socket. All those posterior rotator cuff muscles are kind of like adaptively shortened. It's kind of like pulling the parking brake when you're driving 100 miles an hour, right? Good data set. And then we start to think, all right, 190 degrees, that's your average, right, range of motion. Now, here's the challenge. Take a look at that standard deviation on total motion, right? You have guys that are 14 degrees more. That's one standard deviation. And if you look at a whole Major League Baseball roster, take a 40-man roster, a little more than half is going to be pitchers, probably even more than that when you consider the injury list. So let's say you got 27 guys in the mix. There's going to be one dude that's a couple standard deviations out that's got 215, 220 degrees of total motion. He's going to be absolute Gumby, right? And if you take a stretching intervention to him, you know what you're going to do? You're going to tear his posterior capsule. You might actually subluxate his shoulder, right? Conversely, you're going to have guys that are way, way lower that might be down at 150, 160 degrees of total motion. That's a very stiff shoulder. That's a guy that needs all the manual therapy in the world. That guy needs to get in a dark room and breathe. He needs a lot of the lifestyle stuff that Gray talked about in the last presentation. We can look at it, we can see the same thing at the elbow, but what you don't want to do is overstretch a loose guy and understretch a tight guy, right? So the more and more I've been at this, I stay away from averages, and it's a really tricky thing. Sometimes what you think is actually a deficit because it's not fitting the average is actually their superpower, right? We see guys with crazy pelvic angular velocities when they swing, and then you put them on a force plate and their lead leg is absolutely elite. They block like you wouldn't believe, right? That's how they stop themselves to conform to their hitting approach. So always be willing to embrace weird, okay? And that's a most important takeaway from this presentation. And we're gonna talk about some of the things that we used to actually evaluate where guys are at. What I'm not gonna do is just hand you a bunch of sample programs. It's not what you guys need, right? You're all better than that. What I wanna hopefully do is give you some tools that you can utilize as you try to figure out how to, A, figure out what people need, but B, how to actually train them efficiently. So I always emphasize to folks, programming is the single hardest thing to teach. Right, I've had this conversation over and over again, and unfortunately, it's something that we've created as an industry. Right, programming was a lot easier back in 2007 when we first opened our facility. Well, information overload in the social media era happens every year. 6 interns in the summer class. One of them comes in. He's got 15 initials after his name. He's been to every single specialty course you could possibly imagine, and you ask him to name the 4 rotator cuff muscles, and he can't do it, right? They've taken a go-to-calculus approach when they needed to spend some time on basic math and algebra. So we have a lot of people that have been exposed to very advanced principles because they're all out there, or they have a lot of depth in one area before they built breadth, right? What are we about training young athletes? Build a big foundation, play a lot of sports, and then layer specific skills, and you do really well. If you build a career on one methodology, I'm the kettlebell guy, you're kind of left with your pants down when it comes time to actually have a more substantial career offering, okay? We're always trying to reconcile schools of thought, right? How many of you guys have come to a seminar like this that's maybe more special, right? Here you get exposed to 25 different philosophies over the course of the weekend. How often have you gone to a course and your brain is just thumping on Sunday night? You're wondering what you're actually gonna use Monday morning when you get back. Right? A lot of you guys have been in the industry for a really long time. It might be and come to a talk like this times 10 over the course of the next 3 days, and you walk back in, it changes 1% of your philosophy. It's something that you fit into an existing schema on that one client that you've been struggling with, and you're like, you know what? I saw Grace's presentation on Friday morning. Maybe I need to dig deeper on sleep. Maybe this is a shoulder issue where I need to look at the neck first. Like, that's what seminars are about the longer you've been in the industry. Young coaches don't have that discerning filter. It's really important that we help them with that. 3 personal biases. I was a competitive power lifter for a really long time. I embraced lifting heavy things. It was what I did. And here's the problem. I nowadays probably lift athletes less than I ever have before, right? I've got more and more data telling me that it's slowing them down. It's creating negative, unfavorable adaptations in terms of range of motion, all that stuff. Most coaches have some kind of personal bias, right? So we have to overcome those as we write programs. And like I said, the complexity trap is a real thing, right? One of the things that happened was we have this large video database, right? It was like this Microsoft Excel file that over the course of time just got bigger and bigger and more bloated. Like a coach would learn a new exercise, he'd want to integrate in a program, so we'd have to put it in there. And before you knew it, there were 2,300 exercises in it. It's like, guys, we don't use 2,300 exercises on a daily basis. But what we get is we'd get a coach that'd be like writing a program, and he'd have the video database open, and he'd be like, going over and like looking for something new. I'm like, don't be different just for the sake of being different. Put something in there because you can justify its inclusion. But I think sometimes, we'll have clients that get 13 programs in a 52-week year, right? That's a program every 4 weeks. They don't just get 12 months, they get 13. That's a sign that they don't take any time off from the gym. And you find yourself with those long-term clients just trying to be different, right? When in reality, the novelty should probably come from the environment you create far more than because you did drastically different things with their programming. So getting a little bit more nuanced, right? How many of you guys remember those NSCA textbooks, the acute programming variables, right? We all remember getting volume, load, frequency, exercise selection, exercise order, rest intervals, and tempo/muscle action. All these things were drilled into your head. They were probably in your CSCS exam when you took it way back in the day. Well, here's the thing about it. Did you ever notice that they never told you which ones were most important? Like, that's kind of an important consideration, right? Because they are not all created equal. And here's how I look at it. First off, frequency. It doesn't matter how good your ideas are if your people don't show up to actually exercise, right? If someone works out once a week, it's probably not gonna go super well for them. But if you can find a way to be a little bit more reductionist, I'd rather you go 3 times a week for 20 minutes than once a week for 60 minutes, right? So frequency for me is far and away. If you are moving regularly, motion is lotion, right? That's a good consideration. Secondly, exercise selection, right? We'll talk about this a little bit in the hands-on, but if you have a compression intolerant spine, right? And you put a barbell on its back, it is not gonna go well, okay? That's just frankly, tried and true over and over again. The exercises you pick absolutely matter. You go to hot knee and you do a bunch of forward lunges, it's probably not going to go really, really well. Whereas you do some iso holds, you do some reverse lunges on the slide board, you have a lot of options for overcoming that patellar tendinopathy without frying people up. So exercise selection absolutely matters, particularly I think as we're more and more aware of negative outcomes with respect to exercises in terms of range of motion. Bill Hardman's done a great job talking about this concept of interference. If you guys need proof, take one of your stiffest clients, measure their hip internal rotation and their shoulder flexion, and then go give them a set of trap bar deadlifts for 8 or farmer's walks down and back, and then go remeasure them and see how much range of motion they lose from adding too much stiffness in the wrong ways to their system, right? Or have them go throw a med ball and then go back and test it. You're probably gonna see a very discernibly different outcome for that person. Number 3, load, right? There are situations where someone can handle, and we see it in the baseball population all the time. I throw 82 and it doesn't hurt. I throw 95 and it absolutely hurts. Why? The load is higher on the tissue, right? The implement is the exact same weight, but the speed of movement is higher, right? It's no different if you put a heavier barbell on somebody's back. If you skip steps, we see this a lot in tendinopathy research, right? They can handle a given load, particularly in like an isometric form, but you actually add to a little bit more load to that tendon and you can set it back. So matching tissue tolerance to tissue loading is an important way to avoid that tendinopathy surge we may see. Rest intervals are important. Why? Fatigue is the enemy of motor learning. If you don't give people enough rest between sets while they're trying to learn how to train, they're going to develop some really bad patterns, right? If you need proof, I will bring you to my daughter's gymnastics practice and we can watch 700 push-ups in a matter of 5 minutes during conditioning. It makes my eyes bleed every Tuesday night at 8:30 p.m. You are all welcome to attend, okay? Volume, sets, and reps, right? You can create an amazing stimulus with the right amount of volume, and you can cripple someone if you do the wrong kind of volume. I think tempo and muscle action, I think a lot of people would actually say bump this up a little bit more, right? Especially now that we're getting so much really good research from the likes of Keith Barr on isometrics benefits and what we can really do in terms of stress shielding to benefit tendons and things like that. So some people might move that up just a little bit higher in terms of priority, but certainly like if you had someone with knee pain and you give them an isometric hold at a specific point in a split squat versus taking them all the way down and going through reps, like you might get a more favorable outcome. And then last but not least, exercise order. Probably matters a lot more for elite athletes, but at the end of the day, like if you flip-flop the order of your exercises on a lot of your adult fitness clients, it's probably not gonna change a whole lot, right? So with that said, let's talk about how we assess. And what I'm not gonna do is I'm not gonna blow through demonstrations of assessment here. I actually do wanna do a fair amount of that in my hands-on later on. So if you guys do wanna see a little bit more of the nuances, particularly with respect to some of the clearing tests that we may use, I think personal trainers in general, strength and conditioning coaches are a little less aware of maybe what happens in the clinical community. So it might give you a little bit of an eye for how to refer out and who can help you. So we'll cover that later, but pre-screening is the most important thing. How many of you guys feel that you have a strong administrative staff where you work? 4 hands? That's scary, guys, right? I can say my administrative staff is strong because my wife runs it, and if I said anything otherwise, I'd be in a lot of trouble. But the most important thing is you know that you have all of the information before they arrive. That may be radiology reports, that may be paperwork from a physical therapist that they previously worked with. You always want to chase that stuff on the front end before you evaluate someone. You never want to feel like you're short on information on the first day. That's a chance to win a client over if you feel like you've done your homework on the front end. So I'd rather have more information than not enough. Definitely a big thing that we do, I think, really, really well at our facility. We also do a lot in terms of understanding which staff member is going to be really good for taking on different clients. Like, I might not give a new staff member a complex hip, but I have no problem giving them a 13-year-old untrained baseball player with no injury history. They're going to be way more comfortable taking that on. So I tend to take a lot of the weird stuff, a lot of the post-op cases, things along those lines. Preliminary paperwork. When they arrive, they should be filling out paperwork. Here's what I'll tell you. They will almost always under-report on these things. Why? Because there's too many questions and they want to blow through it, right? Particularly now, and this is something I'm fighting in my own facility when we switched to digital paperwork. I was a pen and paper guy for a long time, created a ton of administrative headaches with things needing to be scanned. Here's the problem. You put somebody on an iPad, it's just like check boxes. Describe your previous health injury. Shoulder. Okay, is that a rotator cuff tear? Is that a labor repair? Is it a surgery? Is it non-surgery? People don't elaborate in the electronic era. So what it means is if you're doing this preliminary paperwork, you got to pull it out of them. You've got to ask a lot of questions. And it may be awkward, right? I have no problem asking a teenage 16-year-old that goes through a posture screen and he's got a bunch of acne all over him. I'll ask him, have you ever taken Accutane? Have you been on any kind of medication there? Because people will underreport. So it's very important that you work to pull it out of them, okay? We go through a very thorough sit-down conversation. That could be everything from, what are your goals? What's your previous training experience? You may ask questions on the skill development side of things. What are you working on with your hitting coaches? What pitches do you throw? What do you feel like your biggest growth areas are going to be? What's your previous training experience? Like, what have you done in the past? Are there any exercises that absolutely are no-goes for you? They've hurt in the past. You don't feel like you'll do well with those. Really, really dig in deep for you. Specific movement assessments, right? So in those situations, specific movement screen is going to be things like joint range of motion, right? Infrasternal angle, shoulder flexion, ankle mobility, stuff like that. Conversely, you're also going to have general movement tests, right? For me, like that's an overhead squat, that's an overhead lunge walk, that's a toe touch. These are more comprehensive multi-joint approaches, right? It's the difference between assessments and screens. If you deal with large groups, you're going to use more screens. If you do a lot more individualized programmings, you're going to do a lot more full-on assessments. Like that's a true specific look. For us, we tend to be very comprehensive with it, just because A, we're very nuanced, mostly in one population. But B, I want that data so that our pitching coaches, our hitting coaches have access to it. So when they do skill development on that side of things, they have everything they need. And then you also have second tier tests, right? Things that are breakout, provocative. I do a lumbar locked rotation screen, and they're super limited in one side, and I'm also seeing that they're really lordotic. I'm gonna do a lateral flexion test on them, whereas I might not do that with absolutely everybody, but I wanna know, is it just a big time QL restriction? What is it that's actually taking place with them? And then certainly a provocative test. If I've got a hip that's really sticky, I might run a Fader and a Faber test just to see if it's like a symptomatic FAI that I'm gonna either A, need to completely work on, or B, refer out to a good manual therapist or physical therapist or whoever it is that can make my outcomes better, okay? I'm gonna throw a lot of information at you, but what I can't overstate enough is I refer out all the time. I sent 3 risks out between Monday and Tuesday last week on college guys that showed up broken for evaluation. We're fortunate, we have Palm Beach Orthopedic Institute right next door to our building, so we can get MRIs and doctor's visits really, really quickly, but it's something that's very, very important. Don't ever be afraid to refer out. And then we do a lot of test, retest, right? We see things on the evaluation that don't make sense, and I'm gonna throw some different interventions at them and see if I can actually improve that. I'm never gonna plow through pain. We'll talk about what those kind of algorithms look like. And then last but not least, you're gonna do performance screens, right? And that might be different for everybody. Strength and power stuff, you can do with force plates. Work capacity stuff, some of you guys may do VO2 max tests or something like that. Not super pertinent for what we do in the baseball community, but I understand why certain people would, okay? When we look at the health histories, remember, clients will always underreport. They won't talk about their medications. You need to know if someone's a diabetic, right? You need to know if somebody's on beta blockers. You need to know if they've been on Accutane. You need to know if they've had heavy antibiotic use. Look at the amount of Achilles ruptures after Cipro prescriptions. Like, some of this stuff is really, really scary, but you need to make sure that you dig in really closely. I ask about food allergies, intolerances, and they ask about blood work. I saw an athlete last week, Division I college baseball player who's had 4 knee surgeries over the last 3 years, and his patellar tendon, his 4th one, is the one that's kind of acting up right now, and they've never looked at his vitamin D. There's a kid who's from New Jersey, went to school in North Carolina. I'm like, there's a good chance he hasn't seen the sunlight very much over the last year. So we emphasize, going out and getting that checked out. So definitely refer that out. You always want to look systemic, right? I love that concept that Gray introduced, wellness before performance, I think is a really important thing to look at. Sleep quality, obviously a big thing. I'm not one to talk about, but I do wear my Oura ring and it makes me feel bad about myself. Just remember also, previous injuries are often the building blocks to chronic structural and functional deficits. So some of these things originate, and if you don't listen when it whispers, you sometimes are just waiting for it to eventually yell. So you want to be proactive about working through some of that stuff with your potential clients and your current clients, okay? So let's talk about some examples. Specific tests, that's gonna be all your joint range of motion, infrasternal angle, isolated strength tests. Like, we might do, dynamometer testing of rotator cuff strength for their athletes. I saw a decathlete last week, with bilateral multiple groin strains, and his adductor strength tested asymmetrical like you wouldn't believe, right? And I'm not a huge believer necessarily in looking at those numbers in isolation, but it was relatively acute. And if you look at the NHL data on groin strains, adductor weakness is a huge predictor of it, right? Your general screens, shoulder flexion, abduction, toe touch, overhead squat, overhead lunge walk, single leg balance, all these things involve multiple joints, combination of both mobility and stability, so you can draw more general insights from those. Provocative tests, things like flexion, abduction, external rotation, flexion, adduction, and internal rotation. Sorry, that's a typo. That should be fader. You can do a bunch of shoulder assessments. You can do a bunch of different things to check out what kind of a spine you have in front of you. Again, don't do those if you're not comfortable with them. But for me, if I have someone who's got a history of one of these issues, I'll happily go ahead and do it just to make sure that I'm not picking an exercise that's wrong for them, right? And if you have someone that fails a heel drop test, you're probably not going to go and lift them really, really heavy. There's someone that probably is going to need to do a lot less loading and attack their outcomes a little bit differently, okay? But let's talk about principles, right? These were just assessments. These are just like ideas, how you gather information. What are the principles? First off, I get to understand the difference between a screen and an assessment, right? A screen is making sure that you are okay to participate, right? An assessment, for me, gathers far more information. It allows us to be much more discerning in terms of what we actually write up in our programs, okay? Always look for red. This will make sense in a little bit, but one of the things that we have done using the cloud that's been really, really impactful for us is we're able to build large sample sizes of data so we can see if something jumps out. It's especially important, like there are days when I'll do 7 evaluations and we'll get all the intake stuff done. They'll train on that first day and I'll go to write the programs on a Monday night. And I'm actually very good about like remembering people's names and how they move and all that stuff, but it's helpful to have some of these things that auto-populate based on the range of motion numbers that we'll put in. So you'll see that in a second here. Always want to identify maladaptation. So here's a great example of that. We probably got a couple of females in this room that are crazy hypermobile, right? Like former swimmers, gymnasts, whatever it is. They've got 15 degrees of elbow hyperextension, hands are super pliable, Gumby. And then you'll see a bunch of those, and every once in a while you'll see one that's just got like brutal shoulder flexion, right? They test hypermobile across their entire body, straight leg raise, their knees practically touching their nose, and then you look at shoulder flexion, it goes to here, right? And more often than not, that's someone who's been like crazy scapular depression. They've been way out of alignment for a really, really long time, to the point that like the stiffness in their lats has actually overcome the lack of stiffness in their shoulder joint. So they will actually maladapt. So when I see something like that that just doesn't make sense, weird stuff, I'm thinking somebody's been in a bad pattern for a really long time, right? We see a lot in like left thoracic rotation and people who are just like stuck like this forever, right? So it just doesn't make sense. So look for weird things. Always consider referring out the DPs, right? Greg just talked about SFMA, dysfunctional, painful patterns, right? The worst thing you can possibly do is try to bang your head. If you turn your head to the left and your neck hurts, strength and conditioning coach, you shouldn't be doing much with that, right? What we should be doing is looking for all of the dysfunctional, non-painful patterns. What are the things that we can work to improve without plowing into somebody's symptoms? And then we refer the DPs out. And you know what? Some of those guys are a shoulder bursitis that respond incredibly well to a subacromial injection, and they feel better and it never comes back, right? You might see a spine that needs a facet injection, right? You might need to see an ulnar neuritis that does well with a 1-week course of Voltaren, and then they never have issues again. So find people that can assist you, whether it's the pharmacological intervention, a manual therapy intervention, an exercise intervention. Build your network. It's very, very important. But just remember, the comprehensive assessment tells you if the juice is worth the squeeze, right? If you do an assessment and an overhead squat looks like this, and they shift out to the side like crazy, probably not worth throwing a bar on that back and seeing how it'll look plus an extra 225, right? So I always tell you the assessment is just giving you a little bit of a roadmap for how fast you're gonna drive, okay? So here's what happens after an assessment. And I don't even remember who this was when I put it in here, but I think it was one of our baseball players. And I can't even read up here. This is the information that we put in. So there's a collection of range of motion screens. I take them. I'll usually dictate it to one of our other staff members. They'll type it all in. So you'll see that we have a collection of both general stuff up top, static posture. We have player notes or athlete notes, collection of different things. So I can look at this right away and say, hey, 50 degrees of right hip abduction, 70 degrees of left. That's probably a left AIC. And then go back up and you'll see it in the static posture. So it just gives us some awareness. And here's the big thing. To the side of that Excel file, or in the drive, I should, so it's a Google Sheet, it'll go here. This basically compartmentalizes based on left shoulder flexion of 110 degrees is extremely limited. That's going to show up as red. Conversely, he's got quite a bit of passive thoracic spine range of motion, so thoracic rotation is not going to be a problem. So what happens here? One, I can quickly jump in and I can see where my high priority areas are when I go back and search. And what's nice is I can just type this into my internet history and the athlete's name comes right up. In many cases, I have a couple years worth of histories. But then the other thing that's good is this goes directly to our skill development department. So our pitching coaches have access to that. And let's say they go and they look at a right-handed pitcher who's got 0 degrees of right hip internal rotation. And when he's throwing from the stretch, I'll do it from this angle, he needs to go from neutral to internal rotation. If you don't have internal rotation, maybe I'm playing around with your foot position on the rubber. We're going to start from 5 degrees and then you IR to 0 instead of going into a position you don't have. Or maybe we just orient them closer to the plate so they need less internal rotation to be successful with their delivery. We did this literally this week with another kid, so it's fresh in my mind. But it just goes to show you that if you collect data well and you have the system set up, you can do some really, really cool things. So we live in the cloud for that reason. Okay. Just going through some performance testing, which I'm going to dig in on with you guys just a little bit here moving forward. For us, force plates, we use Hawking Dynamics. They're great. We also use Proteus to check a lot more rotational capacity, as well as some of the arm speed metrics. We use True Strength, which goes under the same cloud as our force plates through Hawking Dynamics for some of the isolated strength testing. We won't do that with everyone. It's more if we see it with someone that we really think needs it. And then obviously you could do work capacity stuff like, I don't think that video is actually going to show, but oh, there we go. So this would be like a Proteus power test. And here's where it's really helpful. I don't believe in programming with AI. Nobody's gotten there yet, right? Maybe for very reductionist programs. I do believe that AI can help us a ton with respect to giving us very accessible information more conveniently. Does that make sense? So I'm lucky. Our sports scientist on staff is an absolute ninja with all things AI, tech, all this stuff. Every night, a sports science report goes out to our entire staff. And what it does is it includes this on every single one of our athletes that have been evaluated that day, including returning athletes who may have gone for a season, come back to us. And so what we get is we get a collection of different things, right? So this is a force plate graph. I'll orient you guys to what it means in a second here, but we'll get force plates that'll give us everything from peak velocity to modified reactive strength index. We'll get their body weight on it. We can look at asymmetries during the average braking period. We'll get some recommendations. This is an athlete who's low force, low velocity, just needs to get stronger. So he'll make some talks about velocity-based training and things we can do. That's a very sagittal plane test though, right? So what we can also do is then come and look at our Proteus report. This tells me if it's the same athlete, and I think it actually is a different one. If we see a lot of yellow and green, that's an athlete that's very efficient rotationally. That's an athlete that struggles with arm speed. We're not going to see much green and yellow on the far side. So it gives us an idea because we'll see some of these professional baseball players, I kid you not, who are like 15-inch vertical jumps and then they go through a 95 and you're like, what is going on? And then you put them on a Proteus and they're the most efficient rotators you can imagine. Maybe they have just an elite arm speed. You'll see some guys that have horrible sequencing in their delivery, but they were just blessed with a gift from God with respect to their arm. So what it does is it allows us to figure out, is this a sagittal plane problem? Is it a frontal and transverse plane problem? Is this a skill specific challenge? If all this stuff looks great and then they stink at baseball, hey, it's more on the guys outside to figure this out. And I'll actually show you a good example of this in a second. But what's really cool about this is if you deal with a predominance of male athletes, you can compare them. Okay, don't compare females. That generally doesn't work. I have 3 daughters, and I promise you it's not a good fit, particularly when 2 of them are twins. But if you're dealing with athletes, I can take a high school athlete who jumps a 275 peak velocity and has a 210 jump momentum score, and he wants to hit a baseball harder and run faster. I can say, here are the percentile rankings for all of our professional athletes that play the same sport as you, and we can do it by position as well. You know, your corner infielders are going to be bigger and stronger than your center fielders, right? and we have college, and we have high school. So you can actually go and see how these things change. And what's fascinating is strength and power absolutely takes you from high school to college sports. The difference is actually very, very subtle between college and professional athletes. Going from colleges into the pros is much more about skill development, consistency of execution, things like that. But we'll go through and everyone wants to look at jump height. I actually don't place too much stock in that, because if you're comparing an athlete who's 180 to one that's 210, you're going to get very different experiences. So jump momentum for us correlates really highly with exit velocity, favors athletes that are a little bit heavier, right? So your Pete Alonsos, Aaron Judges, those guys will put up huge jump momentum numbers and they hit baseballs hard. Peak velocity carries over a lot more to sprint speed. So the holy grail is to bring jump momentum up while at least preserving or bringing up peak velocity. Just basically, it means you can go faster at the same body weight, or go the same speed at more body weight. Okay. All right, so this is a graph. How many of you guys are familiar with force plate graphs? Okay. So we've got a little experience. Absolute difference maker, and force plates are more affordable than they have ever been. Like I said, we use Hawkins. You'd be shocked at what a difference they'll actually make for you if you work in an athletic population. But just as importantly, how much they will actually give you really objective feedback of progress for your athletes to be able to show them, hey, you didn't train in season, look what happened. So just for context, when this graph, this is just standing still, and we're talking about, again, just a counter movement jump, hands on hips. This is the unweighting phase, and I apologize, the lighting's a little bit off in here. As it starts to come back up, you'll see this kind of change in color right here. This is the braking phase. So I get to the bottom after I've unweighted. This is when I pull the parking brakes to stop myself. The goal is for that to be as thin as you possibly can. And then after I get to the peak of my braking force, this is the propulsive phase. So as it comes back down, this is hang time, and then this is landing, right? So really for all intents and purposes, you have two goals with any kind of force plate graph. Squish it and make it taller, okay? So if you see an athlete that has this really long period, you can go and you can look at different segments. Now, this is the sum of all of it. Right leg is the orange, right leg is the orange, left is the purple right above it. So you can also look at it for asymmetries. Where someone with an ankle problem separates on their asymmetry might be very different than someone who separates at a different point for like a hip issue, right? We know we can look at like peak velocity versus takeoff velocity, right? If I jump a 3.2 peak velocity and then it's a 2.9 takeoff velocity, that's someone that's got an ankle sprain or an Achilles problem that hasn't been rehabilitated. They're decelerating into takeoff. So you'll see these crazy things that show up. So everyone wants to look at the numbers. I stare at graph shape way more. This is super helpful for us when we test guys going into the draft. They do these at the MLB Combine. So you can get a lot of information. You can figure out, hey, if I got this long, squished, long graph that's really high, I probably got someone who's slow strong. And we need to get them some velocity-based training. We need to move faster. Versus if I get this one that kind of peaks and goes right back down, it's super squished. It's easier to make a fast guy strong than it is to make a strong guy fast, right? And you have different graph shapes, right? That's an unimodal graph, right? It goes up, it comes back down. This is what we would call a late peak bimodal, and this is an early peak bimodal. So how many guys have ever ridden a roller coaster? And you come down off it, and you go right back up. You ever feel that moment where it's like, whoa, and you feel like you're about to throw up? Do you know what that is? So you bottomed out, and then your guts have come down and slammed on the bottom of your cavity, right? So that is this guy right here. So he's jumped, right? The braking force happened, propulsion happens. So he's gone down, he's braked, and he's starting to come back up. And as he's coming back up, he gets this hiccup where his guts slam down and he has to overcome it. So he's propelling through his viscera. Does that make sense? Now here's the thing that's crazy about this. There's a well-managed situation, right? This is a guy who is getting his ass kicked by gravity, okay? So he's jumping and it just slams him down. Look at these guys. They are your foot fractures. They are plantar fasciitis. They're the really skinny torsos with the wide hips, right? So when you see a graph like this, the absolute worst thing you can possibly do is throw a bar on their back and load them up like crazy. This is someone that does really well with band-assisted jumping, band-assisted plyos. You're teaching them actually how to manage their center of mass well against gravity. But these guys, I can't tell you how many ones I've seen that come in, really common in like 6'10" guys with size 18 shoes. They get their butt kicked by gravity. And it's really, really challenging because we'll adjust things a lot and they'll make huge progress in the off season. Sometimes they go back to their teams and it's like one size fits all program. Everybody's gonna go get strong and they actually feel worse and worse and worse. And it takes them away from what they need from an athleticism standpoint. So this is a really powerful thing to look at. Probably the coolest example I can show you, this is my daughter, Lydia. January 29th, she fell off a swing set, supracondylar humeral fracture, pretty gruesome CT scan. They reduced it under anesthesia, put 4 pins in. She was in her sling, kind of on the shelf sling was on for 5 weeks, kind of semi-casted for 6. She got into lifting while she was doing it. So it was her left arm, so she could do like kettlebell. She'd come into the gym and train, fell in love with it. So this is what her graph shape looked like. Luckily, she always loved coming to the gym and jumping on the force plates, but had never really gotten going as conditioning. This is what 6 weeks of training for a 10-year-old kid did. Look at how much the graph spiked, but look at how much tighter it is. So you go from basically, there's still the same graph shape, but look at how much braking improved, right? My daughter's a gymnast. I want her to have really good braking proficiency when she comes down into dorsiflexion from the back handspring, right? Achilles ruptures are pretty darn high in the gymnastics community, especially the volume they do it. So pretty cool to see like how much you can actually flip a curve in an untrained athlete. And she put like 1.5 inches on her vertical jump over the course of the 4 weeks, or excuse me, about 6 weeks before she could jump again. So pretty neat to look at. Anyway, force plate's really cool. This is a really important one, and I'm going to talk about later. One of the other things that you need to think about with respect to your planning is what time of year is it, okay? This is one of our Major League Baseball pitchers. Amazing dude, super locked in, was on a team that didn't go to the postseason last year, so he came back and he did his evaluation on October 14th, okay? So these are his initial intake numbers, okay? And then he started training 3 or 4 days later, okay? Look at what happened to all of his numbers on October 4th. So we would kind of jump every Monday as part of his training program just to mix it in. Everything goes to red. Like that is going from baseball shape to gym shape. Everybody comes back. You guys have all seen this with athletes. They play the full season, then they walk in and they just get their butt handed to them, right? So they just don't have a lot of work capacity. This is totally okay. That is part of the training process. That should absolutely happen. And I would argue because that doesn't happen, we have a lot of kids getting hurt with increased specialization, right? They're always selling out for specific adaptations when general adaptations are more important. So here's what actually happened. And I think this is a little bit skewed. So between November and December, he's getting married next year. So they were like going to search out wedding venues, and he had some buddies that got married and stuff. November to December in the baseball world is all weddings for guys. They're all in that age where people get married. So that he was annoyed with how much travel he had to go through. But you see him starting to come out of the red into the yellow. I would argue that it probably would have accelerated a little bit faster. I think he had a little bit too much travel in there. But what you see is over the course of the offseason, you go from red to yellow. And this was his last test before he left for spring training. So this is a guy who went from 213 to 213.7, pretty much comfortable with his body weight. Same body weight, jumped 2.3 inches higher. Jump momentum went from 279 to 298. Peak velocity went up at the same time. All these things look better, but look at the curve. So this is when he came back. Look at how much thinner the braking phase is. Got much, much more eccentric control. The actual numbers are higher. He applied force quicker. So that's what you want in a good offseason. You can see how it improved over the course of time. I showed this to our Major League staff during spring training and said, this is what we need with our guys. This is the most important part of professional baseball. The season is so long. You have to have a good offseason. Where guys get into trouble, particularly when they play well into the postseason, it's like November 1st when the season ends. They have to report February 12th. You got Christmas and New Year's in the middle. Guys want to go on vacation for a period. Before you know it, your offseason's been squished to what could be 16 to 19 weeks, and instead it's become like 9 to 12. So you really have to be locked in. I emphasize that a lot to our guys, but you need time to actually kick their butt and have them maladapt for a couple weeks so you can bring them out of it, okay? Now, Proteus is the same way. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I know a lot of folks don't have access to it, but for all intents and purposes, we have metrics on there that correlate directly to what we want to do, right? If guys want to hit the ball harder, like we can look at rotational shot put power, straight arm trunk rotation, acceleration, and then vertical jump on it as well. All these things were very predictive. So when it comes back to it, if you have athletes that are trying to get better, there are probably objective tests out there that you can pull the numbers from to actually help them be successful, okay? Likewise, Proteus, this is based on 28 pitchers who pre and post tested. I think it was the offseason of 22 to 23, so this is actually a little bit old data. We probably have a lot more, but basically shows direct correlation from vertical jump, the PNF D2 extension, this pattern, as well as shot put, which is a rotational test to actually predict velocity. Again, small sample size, but something that has held up. For context, this is kind of a zoom in on what we look at with those tests. Far right column is what we're looking at from a pure arm speed. So you might see guys that test grade on the force plates They have great rotational patterning here, and then they don't throw hard. And what you do really quickly is you look at PNF extension acceleration, you realize they just got a slow arm. That's a guy who's a good fit for a weighted ball program. Unfortunately, everybody on Instagram wants to go and sell out for the weighted ball program, when in reality, all of the other things are really, really far behind the curve. So we try to just take a very targeted approach to assessment, knowing what qualities that we need to evaluate, what qualities are good, what aren't, and then we discuss it with the athletes. And these things are always really helpful, I think, to learn from a case study standpoint. So I am going to kind of spend some time talking about a few different ones. And I'm probably going a little bit fast in this, so please slow me down. This guy I actually saw about 6 weeks ago. I talk a lot about baseball, so I'm going to give you some variety. This is a football kid. Basically, got asked to like chop block, and I don't know a lot about football, so excuse me if I sound like an idiot. All I know is that 2 300-ish pound guys fell on top of him, and he wound up with a pretty significant OCD lesion in his right knee. So he had surgery back in October, was actually non-weight bearing for between 8 and 12 weeks. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but he basically didn't get off of he was a wheelchair for 4 weeks and then crutches thereafter, straight up through December. Now think about it, I saw him in May, right? So end of May, give or take, or early May. And what actually had happened was he was cleared by his physician, cleared by his physical therapist. They did some jump tests and things like that to return to spring football. So into the first 2 days, 3-hour practices both day, and the thing blew up on him like crazy. Okay, so I got him for an assessment, and there's some pretty glaring stuff. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not convinced that every knee surgery needs to be wildly asymmetrical before we clear them, but he had a pretty noticeable atrophy, ironically more so in calf than he did in quad, but they were both a lot smaller on the surgery side. So we went through this whole test, and what's actually fascinating is it's actually not a bad range of motion screen. Looks pretty good. Honestly, if you've been in physical therapy for 6 months, your range of motion should be good. Particularly if you haven't loaded, you haven't competed a lot, you haven't had a lot of opportunities to maladapt to a training stimulus or excessive volume. Only thing that's a little interesting is kind of limited ER, so you almost kind of start to think, is this like a little bit of a hip anti-version guy? What's the case on it? But for all intents and purposes, it was not a terrible evaluation. Aside from the fact that he had one knee, his surgery side, that was super limited in knee flexion. Put him in prone, you could actually see on the back side of the knee, it was still pretty swollen. Actually had not had a lot of manual therapy as part of his rehabilitation. So what was interesting is our on-site manual therapist threw a couple dry needles in biceps femoris, did a little soft tissue work. We did some tibial IR mobs, and his knee flexion improved right away, felt a decided difference, all that. What was really fascinating, though, is the force plate jumps. So if you actually go and you look at it, it was his right knee that had been injured. So you can actually see that these things separate pretty quickly, okay? So it'll tell you that there's clearly some stuff wrong. It's also kind of an early peak bimodal, not super concerning, but it is a guy, it's a very spread out curve, is the number one thing I would say, is he's slow to break. And not super, propulsive. So I think this is, as we all know, teenagers kind of only know one speed, and that's stupidity. This is a kid that did too much too soon, but he did it on a fundamentally unprepared knee. It was not ready for that level of joint loading. An OCD lesion is not going to do well with too much pounding right after a surgery. So it was actually interesting, is I sent this to the surgeon, who's a good friend. We've gone back and forth. Said, thanks for sending it my way. Interesting evaluation findings. Swelling gone down, but still about there. He was missing about 4 degrees of knee flexion on the surgery side as compared to minus 20 on the non-surgery side. We did a little soft tissue work and some tibial IR mobs, and he got full knee flexion. His force plate jumps were interesting. 12% higher peak propulsive force in the left versus the right, 11% higher left versus right on average braking forces. So it's no surprise we got into trouble when the volume spiked on him too quickly. We talked about spending the next 6 to 8 weeks getting back into symmetry and rebuilding movement quality before adding a ton of volume. Also spoke about strategies you can use for recovery, ranging from banded distractions to MARPO at the end of the session. Going to use symptom and swelling as our benchmarks as we bring him back. So if you're a surgeon, that's the text you want. You want answers for why, otherwise you got to go and do another MRI. You got to have a hard conversation with the mom who's hyperprotective and really concerned about this stuff. But you can't get that without objective data. Right? Otherwise, we're just looking at a swollen knee and we're throwing our hands up in the world. So I fought objective data as much as anybody else, right? I know this technology is expensive. It's cumbersome. You need people to run it, all that stuff. I use it more than ever before. So I'd encourage you guys, whether you're investing in force plates or you're getting a dynamometer or just honestly documenting your evaluations better than you have in the past, it's undeniably important for you to include this stuff, okay? And we actually use the 1080 as well. If you guys are familiar with that, you can look at asymmetrical contributions to sprint speed and stuff like that. So we hadn't even had a chance to test him just because he was already kind of shut down for running just for a little bit. Okay. This one's another cool one. Sorry, going back to a baseball player. This is a high school left-handed pitcher who was 80 to 82, wanted to throw hard, become a Division I prospect, actually trained with a good buddy of mine. And what's interesting, he actually came with his friend who was just last week named as Gatorade State Player of the Year, committed to a big-time university. It was interesting seeing the two of them come in. You never want to compare guys, but they were very different. One of them was really put together, and I'll kind of show you. But what's interesting is there's not a ton of terrible movement here, right? Very limited shoulder flexion on his left side. Probably could use a little bit more hip IR. He's a narrow infrasternal angle. Those guys are usually kind of rotational superpower candidates. So, you don't want to take away what makes them special, but it didn't have that feeling of like he's maladapted where he's just lifted really heavy weights and it's taken away his rotation. And the numbers, thoracic spine rotation, were all good. Plenty of ankle mobility, good straight leg raise. It wasn't super concerning in that regard. And so we're not necessarily taking a movement solution to this, although there are some things he can work on. And then we look at his force play graph. This is him on the top. This is his buddy on the right. Just for context, this is a 3.14 compared to his 307. So peak velocity is relatively close, but the difference is, and sorry, this got cut off, body weight is substantially different. This guy's doing it at about 180 pounds. This one's doing it like 215. So that's a lot more momentum going down the mound, much higher jump momentum score on the bottom than on the top. And obviously, if you look at the graph shape, that's one of those late peak bimodals. There's a kid who probably isn't going to do well with a lot of lifting. We need to let him get back to being springy and all that stuff, and we need to squish the graph. So there's definitely an element of athleticism that plays into this, but it doesn't justify why this guy's throwing 95 and that kid's throwing 81. Like, there are a lot of kids that are less athletic than this dude on the top who are throwing considerably harder, particularly in this day and age. So I'm looking just at force plates. So I say, hey, listen, that's a sagittal plane measure. Let's go and look at like some rotational tests, right? This is the two of them. This is his buddy who's got the D1 scholarship. And you start to look at it and you're like, all right, not necessarily an efficient rotator, which we would have expected him to be better at because of kind of how he's wired. Not a whole lot of arm speed. So, we're starting to piece this together where, all right, he has some sagittal plane challenges. He's got some rotational challenges that we need to work with. And we need to improve his arm speed because that's kind of concerning. He's got literally like half the arm speed that his buddy does on his dominant side, 9.78 versus 5.24. And here's the kicker though. We actually have to ask the baseball coaches what they think. Anybody here a baseball coach? Or have a background in it? You guys are familiar with TrackMan? So TrackMan is a ball tracking software originated in the golf world, has made it out to baseball stuff. And you get these plots, right? This is just a balls and strikes. So you can see he's kind of scattering balls all over the place. The oranges are him working on a sinker. The reds are a four seam. Here's what I'll tell you. So his vertical movement on his four seam is a 9.3. An elite four seam in the big leagues is going to be between 20 and 24. So when you throw a four seam as a left-handed pitcher, you want this to happen. You backspin the baseball and it carries, right? So typically when you look at a spin axis, right, it's going to be like a clock, right? So as a right-handed pitcher, my four seam is probably going to be between 12 and 1. As a left-handed pitcher, it's going to be between 11 and 12. So we can look, and the tilt up there on the top, he's at 11:30. So he's in presumably a good position to throw a four seam really, really hard. And he's got some athleticism, but he's only carrying at 9.3. So what do you look at next? You look at the efficiency. He's throwing a 51% spin efficiency fastball. For context, most major leaguers with elite four seams throw 100% spin efficiency. So what he's basically doing every time he throws a baseball is ripping an accidental cutter. So he's throwing around the baseball from the correct axis instead of actually imparting force to the baseball correctly. So we can go through all of this stuff and be amazing at our job and turn them into freak athletes. If they don't know how to play their sport, it doesn't work, okay? So always have really good skill coaches that are, at the end of the line to help you kind of organize all these thoughts. I always tell people, I'm 100% in a supportive discipline. Strength and conditioning, sports medicine, massage therapy, nutrition, all of us are here to support what skill coaches do well. But it's not our show, it's theirs. And frankly, it's the athlete's show, but what we need to do is we need to put him in a good position. He's actually doing a lot better and has made some progress. They actually wound up, I think, changing him to more of a two-seam platform, and it's worked out well for him. But just goes to show you, like, gym stuff doesn't necessarily fix, skill-specific problems. And that doesn't matter whether you're a baseball player, or field hockey player, or hockey player, whatever it is, okay? All right. Case study. Just because we've done mostly athletes, let's talk about this one. Okay, this is a guy I saw again not long ago. I'm just plugging some stuff. 31-year-old office worker, chronic neck pain and headaches. Right, had done the thorough workup actually from New York City, so he'd seen some of the more prestigious institutions in the country. They had done workups for rule out cancer. He had tried different medications for like the migraines and stuff like that. Hadn't made a big change. One of the things that I noticed for him that I thought was really interesting, and you'll see it. Elbow hyperextension both sides. Okay, and a 31-year-old dude. So if he was just a hypermobile, prepubescent kid, this would have been gone a long time ago. This is a guy who's actually really lax. Okay, and not a crazy competitive athlete. He had swam just for fitness quite a bit in the past, like hiking on the weekends and stuff like that. And he noticed that like long hikes would give him problems. Anytime where like his arms were just free to his side, felt a little bit better when he supported his elbows during sitting. But what's fascinating is you see a hypermobile guy and they've lost range of motion in certain places, particularly shoulder flexion. So we know that if you're limited in left shoulder flexion, you're probably also going to be limited in cervical rotation to that same side, just in terms of how the body aligns itself. Really stiff into left thoracic rotation. Just didn't have a whole lot of movement that he could really tap into. So for me, I'm not worried as much about performance tests because I'm not really worried about this guy performing. I'm worried about him, you know, kind of just being in a pain-free life and being able to exercise the way that he wants to. You also see, so limited left cervical rotation, limited, left shoulder flexion. He's got a sticky hip bilaterally, probably about the same on both sides. Very limited right hip abduction. So this guy's kind of just helicoptered. There's a lot of rotational patterns that don't look good at him. Here's the interesting about it. He had seen multiple doctors for his neck problem. Nobody had taken his shirt off. Do you think that left shoulder might be a little bit low? Okay. This is the opposite of what we see, guys. Go to any Major League Baseball player game, and this is the shortstop between every pitch. Like, watch catch play in the outfield before the game. They catch, they hang out back here, and they go. If you guys watch the French Open final center, every reserve, he's stuck in his right hip. The right shoulder is always low, right? There's an anatomical basis for it, if you guys are familiar with Posture Restoration Institute. But you walk into most professional sports locker rooms, you don't see a whole lot of left shoulder. That should really jump out. Take a look at his clavicle. So on the right side, see the upslope? If you look at like the research, it's like a 6 to 20 degree upslope, depending on the study you look at for a clavicle, right? That's a sign that you have scapular posterior tilt. You have a resting position of the right amount of elevation versus depression, upward rotation versus downward rotation. That right shoulder is actually downsloped, right? So the distal end of his clavicle is lower than the proximal end. This guy sits in an aggressive scapular depression. You can kind of see it even more pronounced on this side. Also downwardly rotated. So a lot of the neck pain that this guy is actually probably feeling is protective tension of his upper trapezius and levator, right? He's sitting really, really low. And what's happening is all these muscles that are excessively lengthened, they're like firing all cylinders. They're laying down these trigger points just to hold him up in this position, right? And the case, you know, the case by case thing we see over and over again is people just want to go like massage the upper traps or throw a dry needle in it. And what happens? They feel good for 20 minutes and it comes right back, right? What happens when these guys, when they go out for a long walk, they go for a hike, gravity is pulling them down. You guys know the rule of sevens when they categorize burn victims, 7%, 7%. This is 14% of your body weight traction and your whole shoulder down. So those guys are just getting killed by gravity. So one of the things that you look to do with them is try to take things that drive scapular depression out of your life, right? Unsupported sitting, where everything's pulled down. Hey, give yourself a little prop at your computer to like break up your day more often. Stay away from long, slow walks. If you're on walks, lots of arm swing, brisk walking, I was like, sprint, don't distance run. I want you to move fast and actually recapture some of that rotation. No deadlifts, no pull downs, no pull-ups. You know, don't just pinch your scaps down and back. That's going to make you substantially worse. We did a lot more bottoms-up carries. Had to do a lot more soft tissue work on the lat to allow that entire shoulder girdle to come back up. But it's eye-opening. You will see some of these like complex problems, which you think maybe are physiological, and they are much more, you know, kind of musculoskeletal in nature. So this goes to show you that you always have to take a multidisciplinary approach for some of these athletes or general population folks. And again, this is a hypermobile guy that was just trying to find stability wherever he could. And some of the loose jointed guys will lay down more trigger points than you can imagine. Sure.
Did he
Totally unaware. Yeah, actually, I showed it to him. The kicker was we did like a dumbbell goblet, like split squat as part of his workout. And like literally his split squat was like this. It was a week of like just hammering home conscious awareness. But I think this is like a PRI line. They said people would rather breathe well and move poorly than not breathe but move well. Like it's a survival type thing. So some of these folks have just developed some kind of habituation to it.
Even a sweater.
Yeah.
Looks tight.
Yeah.
I was more just like I'm a little bit.
Yeah.
Like.
Yeah. Yeah.
You select that.
Yeah. You can just drift.
Just.
It's and I wasn't observing him in his environment. That's probably what happens. What we see a lot are I'll come back up here to show it. When we see the opposite, the low right shoulder driving, they always get stuck in their hips, elbow on the center console, left hand here, left knee touching the door. And I always tell people, hey, set an iPhone timer on your ride home and count how many times you have to fix your left knee from touching the door. They literally just get stuck right back in there. This is like I don't know, maybe he drives a British car or something like that, and he's flip-flopped it. But it was a pretty eye-opening thing. So I find that we always just work a lot better with case studies. I try to do this a lot with our athletes, but in particular our staff, just from a staff education standpoint. And frankly, it's the way we learn, and I think we all bounce ideas off each other and we kind of figure out what works. Also, like integrating other professionals. He got some manual therapy while I was there. Actually, ribs, like treating intercostals, a lot of that was a big difference maker for him. Kind of one of these narrow infrasternal angles. For those of you guys who aren't familiar with it, definitely check out some of Bill Hartman's work, but narrow ISA is going to be, for all intents and purposes, less than 90. Wide ISA is going to be much, much wider. Your narrow ISAs, the ribs are really clenched down, right? They don't get wide versus your wide ISAs. Everything is much further up. They have a hard time closing down. A guy like this is made to be a triple jumper, rotational athlete, something like that. Versus like you get a wide ISA, they're made to be power lifters, linebackers. They're just a little bit more built for it. Right? He's got these thin vertebral or small vertebral bodies that are really equipped for being like bendy and rotation, all that. It's not going to handle compression really, really well versus like looking at NFL offensive linemen. They aren't good rotators, but they're good at running into things and lifting heavy stuff. So you kind of just have to keep it all in mind, all right? So to kind of tie a bow on some of this stuff, closing the loop, you always have to first determine your priorities, what really matters. You just heard me blabber on for an hour about baseball, right? A lot of you folks don't even train baseball players, right? But the principles carry over, right? Understand, like do a needs assessment. Figure out what it is your people need. For some of them, we have a 93-year-old woman that comes in and personal trains for 30 minutes twice a week. She could not care less about what her fastball velocity is. I promise you that. But she has specific needs that we want to work through, right? That's something that you need to talk through with your clients. I'm shocked at how many people don't actually have those conversations before people join. Maybe it's group exercise has kind of jumped off a little bit more over this last decade or so. But I think it's really, really important just to have actual conversations with humans so that you guys can figure out what really matters for your clients. And then also, are you equipped to assess that? To really evaluate where they stand. That's also not just because you want to get training impact, but you want to feed into their motivation, right? If on the front end you can get some kind of objective measure that in turn can lead to you helping them out on the long end and showing them their progress, that's going to feed into more adherence. And we all talked about what's that number one acute programming variable? It's frequency. Frequency is going to be better if you're excited about your outcomes, okay? Number two, document like crazy, right? I do this not just for the sake of writing good programs, getting better outcomes, feeling like I have a better relationship with people, but at some point you might get sued and you should have everything documented. And that's a scary thing to think about, but I'm shocked. You can always tell what kind of a gym you're walking into. I mean, everybody, goes on the road periodically on vacation, you walk in. It's kind of an eye-opening thing when they don't ask you to sign a waiver or give you your medical history or anything like that. Like, I want to know if that 15-year-old kid that just started with us is a type 1 diabetic, right? Because if, God forbid, he passes out in the middle of a session, I want to know whether it's just that he's dehydrated and didn't eat breakfast and then pushed the sled, or is it that he literally took too much insulin and is going to die on me? Like, these are really important things to share. So understanding, like, why you document is important, but number one reason is to protect against downside, okay? Define the difference between what you know versus what you can implement. This is stolen directly from Mike Boyle, right? What I can do one-on-one with one of our Major League Baseball clients that has all the time in the world is a lot different than the outcome I can get sharing insights with a coach who's working with them 1,500 miles away, right? So you have to be aware of there's going to be a separation between the two. And I think a lot of times people really struggle with being able to kind of give in that regard. So sometimes they write really elaborate programs, and how they're actually executed, on the floor is not necessarily what they're hoping to do. So what you know and what you can implement are very different things. That's a huge difference for me between the private sector and working in professional baseball, right? People pay to come and train with us at our facility. There's a little bit of a velvet rope there, right? They're not going to give us their money unless they want to trust in our expertise and actually try. Sometimes in pro sports, college sports, wherever it is, you kind of have to meet them where they're at, particularly as you go to higher levels and the salaries and the personalities get a little bit bigger. Just remember that everything can't adapt optimally at the same time. You have to understand your time horizon. Remember that force plate trend thing I showed you where the guy really got his butt kicked in that first month? That's the important thing is, right, if you're dealing with adult clients, like, you might be trying to chase a whole bunch of qualities all at the same time. So understand, like, there are certain times where we might prioritize certain things over others, right? We know linear periodization is not the best way to do it, but we knew some kind of like an undulating approach, whether it's training multiple fitness qualities in the same session or within the same week, is probably a better way to get where you need to go. If someone wants to get stronger, more conditioned, more flexible, all these different things, you might have a limited window to work with them. So figure out when you prioritize certain things over the others, okay? This is the big one from a productivity standpoint. Number one takeaway, always batch programs. You should never sit down and write one program. Okay, you should schedule yourself so that you are going to write 5, 6, 7 in a row. Like, make it a block. This is the biggest mistake I see young coaches make, is writing one at a time. It is like anything else. It's like, getting into a groove in a sport, right? You don't go through the warm up and then just end it and come back 4 hours later and come back to it. You build, right? And a lot of times, just getting into that mindset, particularly with no distractions, is an absolute difference maker for making better programs, but making them a lot faster. I see way too many people that kind of mix this up. So I would have designated time slots throughout your week when you do a lot of it. I always talk about my Friday 5. My wife gives me a hard time about it. Saturday nights in the Cressey household are not fun. We do schedule for like the upcoming week. We live a very like upside down life. But I know that if I write 5 programs every Friday night, I feel way better about my weekend. And they're usually ones for Monday. But it's, for me, I'm batching them. I'm doing them all at the same time. I always try to do my hardest ones right then, because it's kind of like when my brain is still coming off of a busy week and I'm not getting into like weekend mode at all. I don't leave them for Sunday night just because I know I'm usually running around doing a bunch of different things on that day, okay? Never stare at a blank template. This is also incredibly important. You never want us to open up Microsoft Excel or whatever programming software you use and stare at everything and plug in everything, right? What you always want to do is try to fit all your programs into an existing schema. You want to build on what's worked. Okay, so in other words, I had this evaluation today. It's June of 2025. You know what? This guy is really similar to that pro athlete I evaluated in November of 2024. I'm going to go back and look. I'm going to see how that guy did. I'm going to build off that template, right? Maybe the warm-up's a little bit different. Maybe one's righty, one's lefty. Maybe they had different force play characteristics. Maybe one was a position player, one was a pitcher. But you never want to start completely blank. That's the worst thing you can possibly do. You never want to finger tap while you're like, you never want to be like rattling your hand on the table because you can't think about what you're doing. It's way easier to look at a canvas where you just have to kind of reorganize stuff versus something that's completely blank. So always make sure you're starting from an existing program that you've had success with in the past. And this is why it gets so much easier to program the longer you've been in this industry, right? I remember a lot of people talking about that with Dr. James Andrews when people were seeing, he just retired last year and was still a really successful surgeon right up to the end. But people are like, how is he so popular, like into his 80s? It's like he's got the biggest library in his head. When you go in and you ask about your elbow, he's seen 5,000 elbows just like yours over the past 20 years. And he remembers how many did well conservatively, how many needed surgery, how many needed PRP, how many did well with stem cell. So like you're building this massive library that makes you better and better as your career goes on. But you're never going to tap into it if you're staring at this blank canvas every time and you're never getting into your mode where you actually can recall that stuff. All right, so just for context, this is my off-season flow chart. I oversee programming across the board for the entire Yankees organization. Kind of the way it works is we'll send out large templates, and then we give all of our strength coaches poetic license to program underneath those as needed. Hey, you can set it on fire as long as you can justify to me that this athlete needs something discernibly different, right? Very different experience, right? So narrow ISA, wide ISA for both position players and pitchers. We'll always encourage them to do individualized warm-ups. Use that to also drive the med ball stuff. Like there may be certain med ball drills that they need. Sprint volume or drill selection may depend on what we see mechanically and how they work, what their force velocity profiling shows. So we always give these guys an opportunity to have poetic license and adjust. But I've always found that if you give them a template to work from, then they can actually go and be a lot more efficient with their programming. So that I always try to take that first couple steps out of it. And so this is important, right? We have 260 guys all over the world, right? Some of them are getting programs in Spanish, right? So we need to find something that's absolutely scalable. We do the same thing at our training facility at CSP. So just for context about what kind of goes through my brain, this is the algorithm right now when I deal with baseball players. It's infrasternal angle, some of our table tests. We look at anthropometric characteristics. We look at joint laxity, injury history, their age, physiological profile, what their blood work looks like, sport-specific motor control, right? Do they have 145 degrees of ER passively on the table, but only 90 degrees actively when I check them? What's the work capacity look like? Do they really need to build it? Are they already pretty good? We look at force velocity profiling with both Proteus and with the force plates. We look at plane bias. Some of these guys are sagittal plane monsters and they don't rotate really well. We look at their wrists, right? Certain guys can do different things with their wrists and it may leave them a little bit more it may put them in a better position to throw certain pitches than others. Look at natural arm slot. We can track arm angle over the course of time in our baseball players. Transfer versus interference of training, right? Is this a guy who has already lost a ton of motion? The more we load them, they're going to lose more, right? Or is it someone where I can change the velocity profile of it and we can get a lot more carryover? I look at the timeline, right? I can do a lot more with an athlete who rolls in October at the end of the season versus one that shows up February 1st and says to fix him, right? And then lastly, the competitive calendar. You're going to get a lot more work done in the off season than you are in season, okay? So you guys are going to have your own algorithm. And this thing has honestly probably changed since, 2 weeks ago when I put this slide together, and it's always going to be in flux based on better data, better experiences, and just more awareness of what's worked and what hasn't. So with that said, I appreciate you attending, and I'm happy to answer questions over the course of the day.